This is StoryLinkRadio. The professional storytellers at StoryLinkRadio have been around for a long time. The Irish knew storytellers by the name Shawnee. We are committed to bringing stories to life through the spoken word, as in traditional oral storytelling. We present stories of many genres: ancient myths and legends, short stories, full-length novels, science fiction, high fantasy, philosophy, traditions, classics, drama, fiction, non-fiction, romance, theater, ghosts and haunts, stories of the strange, and much, much more. Our stories may be drawn from contemporary sources or from some dusty, near-forgotten tome. Regardless, it is a treat like no other to listen to stories and tales presented in a live format with the emotion and feeling a true professional storyteller brings, conjuring up images of yesterday, tomorrow, and fantasy. So join us at StoryLink Radio and let us be your Shawnee for a time. Our stories are presented before a live audience, then recorded for the StoryLink Radio podcast for your on-demand listening pleasure. Please visit StoryLinkRadio.com for show notes, to find out how to join our live audience, and for lots of free stuff, including free audiobooks and much more. Visit www.StoryLinkRadio.com. From the annals of the old-time stories, in fact, of the days of Captain Kidd, is Tom Chist and the treasure box. Now, to tell about Tom Chist and how he got his name, how he came to be living at the little settlement of Henlopen, just inside the mouth of the Delaware Bay. Well, my friends, this story must begin as far back as 1686, when a great storm swept the Atlantic coast from end to end. Now, during the heaviest part of the hurricane, a bark, that's a little boat. It's also something a dog does, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a little boat went ashore on the Hen and Chicken Shoals, just below Cape Henlopen, at the mouth of the Delaware Bay. And Tom Chist, the hero of our story, Tom Chist, was the only soul of all those on board the ill-fated vessel who escaped alive. Now, not Tom Fish, Tom Chist. Think, Chist. Yeah, no, C-H-I-S-T. Chest without an E, with an I instead of an E. Yes. Now, this story must first be told because it was on account of the strange and miraculous escape that happened to him at that time that he gained the name that was given to him. The name of Tom Fish. Not Tom Fish, Tom Chist. That's how he got his name. Well, you'll find out how he got his name. Now, even as late as that time of the American colonies, the little scattered settlement at Henlopen, made up of English with a few Dutch and Swedish people, was still only a spot upon the face of the great American wilderness that spread away with swamp and forest. No man knew how far, off to the westward. Now, that wilderness was not only full of wild beasts, but of Indian savages who every fall would come in wandering tribes to spend the winter along the shores of the freshwater lakes below Henlopen. Now, there for 4 or 5 months, they would live upon fish and clams and wild ducks and geese, chipping their arrowheads and making their earthenware pots and pans under the lee of the sand hills and the pine woods below the capes. Now, sometimes on Sundays, when Reverend Hilary Jones would be preaching in the little log church back in the woods, these half-clad red savages would come in from the cold and sit squatting in the back part of the church, listening stolidly to the words that had no meaning for them. But about the wreck of the bark, that's a little boat, in 1686. Such a wreck as that which then went ashore on the Hen and Chicken Shoals was a godsend to the poor and needy settlers in the wilderness where so few good things ever came. For the vessel went to pieces during the night. The next morning the beach was strewn with wreckage, boxes and barrels, chests and spars, timbers and planks, a plentiful and bountiful harvest to be sure, be gathered up by the settlers as they chose, with no one to forbid or prevent them from doing so. Yes, exactly like Hanover. Perfect. Now, the name of the bark, that's a little boat, as found painted on some of the water barrels in the sea chests, was the Bristol Merchant. Well, and therefore she no doubt hailed from England. Now, as I said earlier, the only soul who escaped alive off that wreck was Hanover Fisk. No. Tom Chist. Tom Chist. Now, there's a settler, a fisherman, in fact, named Matt Abramson, and his daughter, Molly. They together found young Tom. Now Tom, he was washed up on the beach among the wreckage in a great wooden box which had been securely tied around with a rope and lashed between two spars, apparently for better protection in beating through the surf. Now, good-hearted Matt Abramson thought he had found something of more than usual value when he came upon this chest, but when he cut the cords and broke open the box with his broadaxe, he could not have been more astonished had he beheld a salamander instead of a baby. A wee bairn of 9 or 10 months old, lying half smothered in the blankets that covered the bottom of that chest. Matt Abramson's daughter, Molly, well, poor Molly, you see, had a baby who had died a month or so before. So when Molly saw the little one lying there in the bottom of the chest, she cried out in a great loud voice that the good man had sent her another baby in place of her own. The rain was driving before the hurricane storm in dim slanting sheets, and so she wrapped up the baby in the man's coat she wore and ran off home without waiting to gather up any more of the wreckage. Now, it was Parson Jones who gave this young foundling his name. When the news came to his ears of what Matt Abramson had found, he went over to the fisherman's cabin to see the wee child. He examined the clothes in which the baby was dressed. They were of a fine linen, and handsomely stitched too, and the reverend gentlemanly opined that the foundling's parents must have been of, quality people. A kerchief had been wrapped around the baby's neck and under its arms and tied behind it. In the corner, marked with very fine needlework, were the initials T.C. Now, I know there's certain companions of ours who'd probably say that stood for the cat, but I don't think in this case it did. So the Parson Jones asked Molly, "What do you call him, Molly?" He was standing as he spoke, with his back to the fire, warming his palms before the blaze. The pocket of the great coat he wore bulged out with a big case bottle of spirits which he had gathered up out of the wreck that afternoon. "I see. What do you be calling him, Molly?" I think I'll call him Tom, after my own baby." Well, that goes very well with the initial on the kerchief," said Parson Jones. "What other name do you give him? Let it be something that goes with C." "Well, I don't know," said Molly. "Why not call him Chist, since he was born in a chist out of the sea? Tom Chist. The name goes off like a flash in the pan." And so, my friends, Tom Chist, as he was called, and Tom Chist, he was christened. Well, so much for the beginning of the history of Tom Chist. Now, the story of Captain Kidd's treasure box does not begin until the late spring of 1699. Now, that was the year, I'm sure as I look around the room, some of you know because you're probably there. I know I was. That was the year the famous pirate captain coming up from the West Indies sailed his sloop into the Delaware Bay, as you'll recall, where he lay over for a month waiting for news from his friends in New York. New York? Yes, sir, New York. For he had sent word to that town asking if the coast was clear enough for him to return home with the rich prize he had brought from the Indian seas and the coast of Africa. And meantime, this certain famous pirate captain lay there in the Delaware Bay waiting for a reply. Before he left, he turned the whole of Tom Chist's life topsy-turvy with something that he brought ashore. Now, by that time, Tom Chist had grown into a strong-limbed, thick-jointed boy of 14 or was it 15 years of age. It was a miserable dog's life Tom lived in with old Matt Abramson, for the old fisherman was in his cups more than half the time. And when he was so there was hardly a day that passed he did not give Tom a curse or a buffet or as like as not an actual beating. Now remember, I said Matt Abramson was a good-hearted fellow, and he was, except when he was in his cups, which was more than half the time. Well, I'm sure you can imagine poor Tom Chist's life, and one would have thought that such treatment would have broken the spirit of the poor little foundling. Aye, but it had just the opposite effect upon Tom Chist, who was one of your stubborn, sturdy, stiff-willed fellows, if you will, who only grew harder and more tough the more they're ill-treated. It had been a long time now since he had made any outcry or complaint at the hard usage he suffered from old Matt Abramson. At such times he'd shut his teeth and bear whatever came to him, until sometimes a half-drunken old man would be driven almost mad by Tom's stubborn silence. Aye, maybe he would stop in the midst of the beating he was administering and grinding his teeth and cry out, "Oi, won't you say naught to me? Won't you say naught then? Well then, I'll see if I can make you say naught." Well, when things had reached such a pass as this, Molly, Tom's unadopted mother, would generally interfere to protect her foster son. And then she and Tom would together fight the old man until they had wrenched the stick or the strap out of his hand. And then old Matt would chase them out of doors and around the house for maybe half an hour until his anger was cool. Then he'd go back again, and for a time the storm would be over. Ah, the joys and fun of childhood, eh? Well, besides his foster mother, Tom Chist had a very good friend in Parson Hilary Jones, who used to come over every now and then to Abramson's hut upon the chance of getting a half a dozen fish for breakfast. Now, Parson Jones always had a kind word or two for Tom, who during the winter evenings would go over the good man's house to learn his letters and, to read and write and cipher a little, so that by now he was able to spell the words out of the Bible and the almanac, and he knew enough to change tuppence into 4 halfpennies. Now, this is the sort of boy that Tom Chist was, and this is the sort of life he led. Remember I told you something else happened, and it happened in the late spring, it was the early summer, of 1699. The Captain Kidd's sloop sailed into the mouth of the Delaware Bay and changed the whole fortune of Tom's life. Yes, that's correct, Rick. He could put his shoes on the correct feet, and when he had his shoes off, he could count to 20. Now, this is how you come to the story of Captain Kidd's treasure box, you see. Old Matt Abramson, well, he used his fingers too, Callie. I mean, it was 10 toes, 10 fingers, so he could count to 20, you see. Probably could count pretty high, much higher. He was a pretty bright boy. Pretty bright boy. Old Matt Abramson kept the flat-bottomed boat in which he went fishing some distance down the shore, in the neighborhood of the old wreck that had been sunk on the shoals. Now, this was the usual fishing ground of the settlers, and here old Matt's boat generally lay drawn up upon the sand. Now, there'd been a thunderstorm this particular afternoon, and Tom had gone down the beach to bail out the boat in readiness for the morning's fishing. Now, it was full moonlight now, as he was returning, and the night sky was full of floating clouds, and now and then there was a dull flash to the westward, and once a muttering growl of thunder promising another storm to come. All that day the pirate sloop had been lying just off the shore back of the capes, and now Tom Chist could see the sails glimmering pallidly in the moonlight, spread for drying after the storm. He was walking up the shore homeward, when he became aware that at some distance ahead of him there was a ship's boat drawn up on a little narrow beach, and a group of men clustered about it. He hurried forward with a good deal of curiosity to see who had landed. But it was not until he had come close to them that he could distinguish who and just what they were. And then he knew that it must be a party who'd come off the pirate sloop. They'd evidently just landed, and 2 men were lifting out a chest from the boat. One of them, naked to the waist, and the other was a man in his shirt sleeves, wearing a petticoat breeches and a Monterey cap upon his head, a red bandana, a handkerchief around his neck, and gold earrings in his ears. He had a long plaited queue hanging down his back, and a great sheath knife dangling from his head. Now another man, evidently the captain of the party, stood at a little distance as they lifted the chest out of the boat. He had a cane in one hand and a lighted lantern in the other, although the moon was shining as bright as day. Now this man wore jack boots and a handsome laced coat. He had a long, drooping mustache that curled down below his chin. He wore a fine feathered hat, and his long black hair hung down upon his shoulders. And is it just me? The only place I've ever heard the word Q, in reference to like a long ponytail, is either in pirate stories or the Na'vi and Pandora. Maybe I don't read enough. Anyway, all this stuff Tom Chist could see in the moonlight that glinted and twinkled upon the gilt buttons of his coat. Absolutely, the pirates care about their fashion sense. In fact, what was the pirate's name who first taught us to say "R" and what pirates dressed like, Kelly? Howard? Caledonia knows. These men were so busy lifting the chest from the boat that at first they did not observe. That's it, Robert Newton. Sorry. Howard Pyle's the one who wrote this story. I got confused. Did I mention I'm drinking a bit of Tuaca? It's nice and warm and goes down smooth, and it's cold here. Anyway, these men, who evidently were pirates, we think, were so busy lifting the chest from the boat that at first they did not observe that Tom Chist had come up and was standing there. Now it was the man with the long plated queue and the gold earrings that spoke to him. "Aye, boy, what do you want here, boy?" he said in a rough, hoarse voice. "Where do you come from?" And then dropping his end of the chest, and without giving Tom time to answer, he pointed off down the beach and said, "You'd better be going about your own business if you know what's good for you. And don't you come back, or you'll find what you'll find what you don't want a-waiting for you here." Now Tom saw in a glance that the pirates were all looking at him. And then, without saying a word, Tom wisely turned and walked away. Just as his boyhood hero, Robin, he bravely turned and walked away. Now the man who had spoken to him followed him threateningly for some little distance, as though to see that he had gone away as he was bidden to do. But presently he stopped, and Tom hurried on alone until the boat and the crew and all were dropped away behind and lost in the moonlight night. Then he himself stopped also, and turned and looked back whence he had come. Now, there had been something very strange in the appearance of the men he had just seen. I mean, something beyond the puffy shirts and earrings and all. Something very mysterious in their actions. And Tom wondered what it all meant, and what they were going to do. He stood for a little while thus looking and listening. He could see nothing. He could hear only the sound of the distant talking. What were these men doing on the lonely shore thus at night? And then, following a sudden impulse, he turned and cut off across the sand hummocks, skirting around inland, but keeping pretty close to the shore nonetheless, his object being to spy upon these men and to watch what they were about from the back of the low sand hills that fronted the beach. Tom had gone along some distance in his circuitous return, when he became aware of the sound of voices that seemed to be drawing closer and closer to him as he came toward the speakers. He stopped and he stood listening, and instantly, as he stopped, the voices stopped also. He crouched there silently in the bright glimmering moonlight, surrounded by the silent stretches of sand, and the stillness seemed to press upon him like a heavy hand. Then suddenly the sound of a man's voice began again. As Tom listened, he could hear someone slowly counting. 91, the voice began. 92, 93, 94, 95, 96, 97, 98, 99, 100, 101. The slow, monotonous count coming nearer and nearer. 102, 103, 104, 105, 100, and so on in his monotonous reckoning. Suddenly he saw 3 heads appear above the sandhill, so close to him that he crouched down quickly with a keen thrill, close beside the hummock near which he stood. Now, naturally, at first he thought they were counting bottles of beer, but it turned out there was no bottles of beer to be seen, and so Tom's fear now was that they might have seen him in the moonlight. Aye, but fortune had it, they had not, and his heart rose again as the counting voice went steadily on. 120, it was saying, and 21, and 22, and 23, and 24, and 25, and then he who was counting came out from behind the little sandy rise into the white and open level of shimmering brightness. And nary a bottle of rum did he have about him, so seemingly he was counting something else. Now it was the man with the cane who Tom had seen some time before the captain of the party had landed. He carried his cane under his arm now, and was holding his lantern close to something that he held in his hand, and upon which he looked narrowly as he walked with a slow and measured tread in a perfectly straight line across the sand, counting each step as he took it. 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30. Behind him walked the 2 other figures. One was a half-naked dark man, the other man with the plated queue and the earrings, whom Tom had seen lifting the chest out of the boat. Now they were carrying the heavy box between them, labouring through the sand with a shuffling tread as they bored onward. As he who was counting pronounced the word 30, the 2 men set the chest down on the sand with a grunt. The white man, panting and blowing, is wiping his sleeve across his forehead, and immediately he who counted took out a slip of paper and marked something down upon it. Now they stood there for a long time, during which Tom lay behind the sand hummock watching them, and for a while the silence was uninterrupted. In this perfect stillness, Tom could hear the washing of the little waves beating upon the distant beach, and once the faraway sound of a laugh from one of those who stood by the ship's boat. 1, 2, 3 minutes passed, and then the men picked up the chest and started on again. And then again the other man began his counting. 31, 32, 33, 34. He walked straight level across the open, still looking intently at that which he held in his hand. 35, 36, and 37, and 30. Anyway, so on and on he went until the three figures disappeared into the little hollow between the two sand hills on the opposite side of the open, and still Tom could hear the sound of the counting voice in the distance. Now, just as they disappeared behind the hill, there was a sudden faint flash of light, and by, as Tom lay still listening to the counting, he heard after a long interval a far-away muffled rumble of distant thunder. He waited for a while. Then he arose and stepped to the top of the sand hummock behind which he had been lying. He looked all about him, and there was no one else to be seen. And then Tom stepped down from the hummock and followed in the direction which the pirate captain and the two men carrying the chest had gone. Tom crept along cautiously, stopping now and then to make sure that he still heard the counting voice, and when it ceased he lay down upon the sand and waited until it began again. Presently, so following the pirates, Tom saw the three figures again in the distance, and skirting around the back of a hill of sand covered with coarse sedge grass, he came to where he overlooked a little open level space gleaming white in the moonlight. The three pirates had been crossing the level of sand, were now not more than 25 paces from Tom. They had again set down the chest upon which the white man with the long queue and the gold earrings had seated to rest himself, the other half-naked man standing close behind him. The moon shone as bright as day and full upon his face. It was looking directly at Tom Chist it was, every line as keen, cut with white lights and black shadows, as though it had been carved in ivory and jet. Tom sat perfectly motionless. And then Tom drew back with a start, almost thinking he had been discovered. He lay silent, his heart beating heavily in his throat. But there was no alarm. And presently he heard the counting begin again. And when he looked once more, he saw they were going away straight across the little open. A soft sliding hillock of sand lay directly in front of them. They did not turn aside, but went straight over it. The leader helping himself up the sandy slope with his cane, still counting, and still keeping his eyes fixed upon that which he held in his hand. Then they disappeared again behind the white crest on the other side. So Tom followed them cautiously until they had gone almost a half a mile inland. And when he next saw them clearly, it was from a little sandy rise which looked down like the crest of a bowl upon the floor of sand below. Upon this smooth white floor the moon beat with almost dazzling brightness. The man who had helped carry the chest was now kneeling, busied at some work or other, and though what it was Tom at first could not see, he was whittling the point of a stick into a long wooden peg, and when by and by he had finished what he was about, he arose and he stepped to where he, who seemed to be the captain, had stuck his cane straight upright in the ground as though to mark some particular spot or other. He drew the cane out of the sand, thrusting the stick down in its stead. Then he drove the long peg down with a wooden mallet which the dark man had handed to him. The sharp rapping of the mallet upon the top of the peg sounded loud to the perfect stillness. And Tom, laying, watching, wondering what it all meant. The man, with quick repeated blows, drove the peg farther and farther down into the sand until it showed 2 or 3 inches just above the surface. As he finished his work, there was another flash of light, and by, another smothered rumble of thunder. And Tom, as he looked out toward the westward, saw the silver rim of the round and sharply outlined thundercloud rising slowly up into the sky and pushing the other broken drifting clouds before it. Now the 2 white men who were now stooping over the peg, the dark man watching them both. Then presently the man with the cane started straight away from the peg, carrying the end of a measuring line with him, the other end of which the man with the plated cue held against the top of that peg. When the pirate captain had reached the end of the measuring line, he marked across the open sand. Then again they measured out another stretch of space. And so they measured a distance 5 times over. And then from where Tom lay, he could see the man with the cue drive another peg just at the foot of the sloping rise of sand that swept up beyond into a tall white dune marked with sharp and clear against the night sky behind. Now as soon as the man with the plated cue had driven the second peg into the ground, they began measuring again. And so, still measuring, they disappeared in another direction, which took them in behind the sand dune, where Tom no longer could see what they were doing. Now the dark man, he still sat by the chest where the 2 had left him. and so bright was the moonlight that from where he lay, Tom could see the glint of it twinkling in the whites of his eyeballs. Presently, from behind the hill, there came for the third time the sharp rapping of the mallet, driving still another peg. Then, after a while, the two pirates emerged from behind the sloping whiteness into the space of the moonlight again. They both came back direct to where the chest lay. The white man and the dark man lifting it once more, they walked away across the level of open sand, and so on behind the edge of the hill and out of Tom's sight. Now, Tom Chist, as I say, could no longer see what the pirates were doing. Neither did he dare to cross over the open space of sand what now lay between them and him. He lay there speculating as to what they were about. And meantime, the storm cloud was rising higher and higher above the horizon, with louder and louder mutterings of thunder following each dull flash from that cloudy, cavernous depths. In the silence, Tom could hear an occasional click as of some iron implement, and he opined that the pirates were probably burying the chest, though just where they were at work he could neither see nor tell. Still he lay there watching, listening, and by a puff of warm air blew across the sand, and a thumping tumble of louder thunder leaped up out of the belly of the storm cloud, which every minute was coming nearer and nearer. Still, Tom Chist lay watching. Now suddenly, almost unexpectedly in fact, the three figures reappeared from behind the sand hill, the pirate captain leading the way, the dark man and the white man following close behind them. They had gone about halfway across the white sandy level between the hill and the hummock behind which Tom Chist lay, and the white man stopped and bent over as though to tie his shoe. This brought the dark man a few steps in front of his companion. Now that which then followed happened so suddenly, so unexpectedly, so swiftly, that Tom Chist had hardly time to realize what it all meant before it was over. As the dark man passed by him, the white man arose suddenly and silently erect, and Tom Chist saw the white moonlight glint upon the blade of a great dirk knife which he now held in his hand. He took 2 silent cat-like steps behind the unsuspecting dark man, and then there was a sweeping flash of the blade in the pallid light, and a blow, the thump of which Tom could distinctly hear even from where he lay stretched out upon the sand. There was an instant echoing yell from the dark man, who ran stumbling forward, who stopped, regained his footing, and then stood for an instant as though rooted to the spot. Tom had distinctly seen the knife enter his back, and even thought that he had seen the glint of the point as it came out from the breast. Now, meantime, the pirate captain had stopped, and now stood with his hand resting upon his cane, looking impassively on. And then the dark man started to run. The white man stood for a while glaring after him, and he, too, started after his victim upon the run. The dark man was not very far from Tom when he staggered and he fell. He tried to rise, and he fell forward again and lay at length. At that instant, the first edge of the cloud cut across the moon. It was a sudden darkness. But in the silence, Tom heard the sound of another blow and a groan, and then presently a voice calling to the pirate captain that it was all over. He saw the dim form of the captain crossing the level sand, and then as the moon sailed out from behind the cloud, he saw the white man standing over a dark figure who lay motionless upon the sand. And then Tom Chist scrambled up and ran away, plunging down into the hollow of sand that lay in the shadows below. Over the next rise he ran, and down again into the next black hollow, and so on over the sliding, shifting ground, panting, gasping. It seemed to him he could hear footsteps following, and in the terror that possessed Tom, he almost expected every instant to feel a cold knife blade slide between his own ribs, in such a thrust from behind as he had seen given to the poor dark man laying now dead upon the sand. And so Tom ran on like one in a nightmare. His feet grew heavy like lead. He panted and gasped. His breath came hot and dry in his throat. But still he ran, until at last he found himself in front of old Matt Abramson's cabin, gasping, panting, sobbing for breath, his knees relaxed and his thighs trembling with weakness. As Tom opened the door and dashed into the darkened cabin, for both Matt and Molly were long ago asleep in bed, there was a flash of light, and even as Tom slammed to the door behind him, there was an instant peal of thunder, heavy as though a great weight had been dropped upon the roof of the sky, and so that the doors and the windows of the cabin rattled in the darkness. And then Tom Chist crept to bed, trembling, shuddering, bathed in sweat, his heart beating like a trip hammer, and his brain dizzy from that long, terror-inspired race through the soft sand in which he had striven to outstrip he knew not what pursuing him in horror. For a long, long time Tom lay awake, trembling, chattering with nervous chills. And when he did fall asleep, it was only to drop into monstrous dreams in which he once again saw ever enacted, with various grotesque variations, the tragic drama which his waking eyes had beheld the night before. Then came dawning of the broad, wet daylight, and before the rising of the sun, Tom was up and out of doors to find the young day dripping with the rain of overnight. Now, Tom's first act was to climb the nearest sandhill and to gaze out toward the offing where the pirate ship had been the day before. But look as he might, the pirate ship was no longer there. Soon afterward, Matt Abramson came out of the cabin. He called to Tom to go get a bite to eat, for it was time for them to be away fishing. All that morning, the recollection of the night before hung over Tom's chest like a great cloud of boding trouble. It filled the confined area of the little boat and spread over the entire wide spaces of sky and sea that surrounded them. Not for a moment was it lifted. Even when he was hauling in his wet and dripping line with a struggling fish at the end of its recurrent memory of what he had seen would suddenly come upon Tom, and he would groan in spirit at the recollection. He looked at Matt Abramson's leathery face, at his lantern jaws cavernously and stolidly chewing at a tobacco leaf, and it seemed monstrous to him the old man should be so unconscious of the black cloud that wrapped them all about. When the boat reached the shore again, Tom leaped scrambling to the beach, and as soon as his dinner was eaten, he hurried away to find the Dominie Jones. He ran all the way from Abramson's hut to the parson's house, hardly stopping even once. When he knocked at the door, he was panting and sobbing for breath. The good man was sitting on the back kitchen step, smoking his long pipe of tobacco out in the sunlight, while his wife within was rattling among the pans and dishes in preparation of their supper, of which a strong porky smell already filled the air. Then Tom Chist told his story, panting, hurrying, tumbling one word after another in his haste, and Parson Jones listened, breaking every now and then into an ejaculation of wonder. The light in his pipe went out, and the bowl turned cold. And I don't see why they should have killed the poor dark black man laying there in the sand at all, said Tom as he finished his narrative. Aye. Well then, said the Reverend, it's easy to understand, Tom, my boy. You see, it was a treasure box what they buried. Now in his agitation, Mr. Jones had risen from his seat and was now stumping up and down, puffing at his empty tobacco pipe as though it were still alight. Aye, a treasure box was it, cried out Tom. Aye, my lad, a treasure box. And that was why they killed the poor dark man, you see. He was the only one, don't you see, besides the two who knew the place, where 'twas hid. And now that they've killed him out of the way, there's nobody but themselves that knows. Aye, the villains. Tut, tut, look at that now. In his excitement, Parson Jones had snapped the stem of his tobacco pipe in two. Why then, said Tom, if that is so, it is indeed a wicked bloody treasure, and fit to bring a curse upon anybody who finds it. It is more like to bring a curse upon the soul who buried it, said Parson Jones. Aye, indeed it might even be a blessing for him who finds it, be he a stranger or otherwise. But tell me, Tom, my boy, tell me, do you think you could find the place again where it was hid, Well, I can't tell that, said Tom. It was all in among the sand humps, so you see, it was at night in the bargain. Maybe we could find the marks of their feet in the sand, though. Aye, Tom, my boy, that's not likely. The storm last night would have washed all that away, said the reverend gentleman. Well, I could find the place, said Tom, where the boat was drawn up upon the beach. Ah, Tom, my boy, that there is something to start from. If we can find that, then maybe we can find whither they went from there. Well, if I was certain it was a treasure box, cried out Tom Chist, I would rake over every foot of sand betwixt here and Henlopen to find it. I bet you would. I bet you would, my boy. But it would be like hunting for a pin in a haystack, said the Reverend Hilary Jones. Now, as Tom walked away home, it seemed as though a ton's weight of gloom had been rolled away from his soul. The next day, he and Parson Jones were to go treasure hunting together. It seemed to Tom as though he could hardly wait for the time to come. And so, the next afternoon, Parson Jones and Tom Chist started off together upon the expedition that made Tom's fortune forever. Tom carried a spade over his shoulder, perhaps we should call it and the reverend gentleman walked along beside him with his cane. As they jogged along the beach, they talked together about the only thing they could talk about, the treasure box. Hey, and Tom, my boy, how big did you say it was? Well, it was about so long, said Tom, just measuring off upon the spade, and about so wide, and maybe this deep. Oh, Tom, my boy, and what if it should be full of money, Tom? Said the reverend gentleman, swinging his cane around and around in wide circles in the excitement of the thought as he strode along briskly. Suppose it should be full of money. What then? Well, by Moses, said Tom Chist, hurrying to keep up with his friend. I'd buy a ship for myself, I would, and I'd trade to India and to China, to my own boot, I would. Suppose the chest was all full of money, sir, and suppose we should find it. Would there be enough in it, do you suppose, to buy a ship? Oh, Tom, just be sure there'd be enough, Tom. Enough to spare a good big lump left over. Aye, and if I find it's mine to keep, is it, and no mistake? Why, to be sure it'd be yours, cried out the parson in a loud voice. Just sure it'd be yours, Tom. He knew nothing of the law, but the doubt of the question began at once to ferment in his brain. He strode along in silence for a while. Who else would it be but yours if you find it? Can you tell me that? If ever I have a ship of my own, said Tom Chest, and if ever I sail to India in her, I'll fetch you back the best chest of tea, sir, that ever was fetched from Cochin China. Now, Parson Jones burst out laughing. Oh, thank you, Tommy. And I'll thank you when I get my chest of tea. But tell me, Tom, didst thou ever hear of the farmer girl who counted her chickens before they were hatched, eh? Now it was thus that the two of them talked as they hurried along up the beach together, and so came to a place at last where Tom stopped short and stood looking about him. It was just here, he said. I saw the boat last night. I know it was here, for I mind me of that bit of wreck yonder. There was a tall stake drove down in the sand just where the yon stake stands. Parson Jones put on his barnacles and went over to the stake, toward which Tom pointed. As soon as he had looked at it, he carefully called out, Why, Tom, this hath just been drove down into the sand. It is a brand new stake of wood. The pirates must have set it there themselves as a mark, just as they drove the peg you spoke about down in the sand. Tom came over and looked at the stake. It was indeed a stout piece of oak nearly 2 inches thick. It had been shaped with some care, and the top of it had been painted a red. He shook the stake and tried to move it, but it had been driven or planted so deeply in the sand he could not stir it. Aye, sir, it must have been set here for a mark, for I'm sure it was not here yesterday or the day before. He stood looking about him to see if there were other signs of the pirates' presence. At some little distance there was the corner of something white sticking up out of the sand. He could see it was a scrap of paper. He pointed to it, calling out, Oh, yonder's a piece of paper, parson, sir. I wonder if they left that behind them. Now, as you can imagine, it was a miraculous chance that placed that paper there. There was only an inch of it showing. If it had not been for Tom's young sharp eyes, it would certainly have been overlooked and passed by. The next windstorm would have covered it up, and all that afterward happened tonight, happened that night, I should say, would never have occurred at all. Look, sir, he said, as he struck the sand from it. It hath writing upon it. Aye, let me see that, Tom, said Parson Jones. He adjusted his spectacles a little more firmly astride of his nose. He took the paper of his hand and began conning. What's all this, then? It's a whole lot of figures and nothing else. And then he read aloud. Mark. S. Period S. Period W. S by S. SSWS by S. What do you suppose that means, Tom? Well, I don't know, sir, I'm sure. But maybe we can understand better if you read on. There's nothing. It's all a great lot of figures, said Parson Jones, without a grain of meaning in them so far as I can see. Unless they be, sailing directions. And then the parson began reading again. Mark. SSW by S. 40, 72, 91, 130, 151, 177, 232, 255, 56, 271. Do you see? It must be sailing directions. 299, 335, 362, 386, 415, 446, 469, 491, 522, 544, 571, 598. Oh, what a lot of them there'd be. 626, 652, 676, 695, 724, 851, 876, 905, 940, 967. Oh, wait. Peg, it says. Peg. S-E by E. 269 foot. Peg. S-S-W by S 427 foot. Peg. Dig to the west of this. Dig to the west of this 6 foot, it says. What's that about a peg? Exclaimed Tom. What's that about a peg? And then there's something about digging, too. It was as though a sudden light began shining into his brain. He felt himself growing quickly very excited. Read that over again, sir. Read it. Why, sir, you remember I told you they drove a peg into the sand, and don't they say to dig close to it? Read it over again, sir. Read it over again. Peg, said the good gentleman. Oh, to be sure it was about a peg, Tommy. Let's look again. Yes, here it is. Peg, S-E by E, 269 foot. Aye, cried out Tom Chist in great excitement. Don't you remember what I told you, sir? 269 foot. Sure, that must be what I saw them measuring with the line. Parson Jones had now caught the flame of the excitement that was blazing up so strongly in Tom's breast. He felt as though some wonderful thing was about to happen to them. To be sure, he called out in a great big voice. And then they measured out 427 foot south. Southwest by south. S-W by S, don't you see? And then they drove another peg. Then they buried the box 6 foot to the west of it. Oh, why, Tom Chist, if we read this aright, thy fortune is made, boy. And so Tom Chist stood staring straight at the old gentleman's excited face and seeing nothing but it in all the bright infinity of sunshine. Were they indeed about to find a treasure chest? Check back with us next week for the exciting conclusion. No, wait, we still have time. I'm sorry. He felt the sun very hot upon his shoulders. He heard the harsh, insistent jarring of a tern that hovered and circled with a forked tail and sharp white wings in the sunlight just above their heads. One time Tom caught one of those birds, and he tossed it about all night. To try and get some sleep, you see. He was tossing a tern all night. Ha ha, it's a joke, don't you know? Anyway, all the time Tom stood standing there, staring into the good old gentleman's face. It was Parson Jones who spoke first. But what do all these figures mean, then? Tom observed how the paper shook and rustled in the tremor of excitement that shook his hand. He raised the paper to the focus of his spectacles and began to read again. Mark 40, 72, 80, 91. Mark, cried out Tom, almost screaming. Well, either that's a hair-lipped dog, or that must mean the stake over there yonder. That must be the mark, I'm thinking. And he pointed to the oaken stick with its red tip blazing against the white shimmer of the sand behind it. Well, the 40 and the 72 and the 91, cried the old parson in a voice equally shrill. Why, that must mean the number of steps the pirate was counting when you heard him, Tom. Why, to be sure that's what they meant, said Tom Chist. That is it, it can't be nothing else. If the blue Cheshire cat was around, I'd check with her, but I'm pretty sure that's what it's got to mean. Oh, come, sir, let us make haste and find it. Aye, stay, said the good gentleman, holding up his hand, and again Tom Chist noticed how it trembled and shook. His voice was steady enough, though very hoarse, but his hands shook and trembled as though with a palsy. Stay, first of all, we must follow these measurements. It is a marvellous thing, he croaked after a little pause, how this paper ever came to be here in the first place. Aye, maybe it was blown here by the storm then, suggested Tom Chist. Like enough, said Parson Jones. Like enough after the wretches had buried the chest and killed the poor dark man. Oh, they were so buffeted and bowsed by the storm that it was shook out of the man's pocket, and this blew away from him without his knowing aught of it. Aye, but let us come find the box, cried Tom Chist, flaming with excitement. Aye, said the good man. Only stay a little, my boy, until we make sure what we're about. What I'm trying to say, Thomas, I've got my pocket compass here, but we must have something to measure off the feet when we have found the peg, you see. You run across to Tom Brooks' house, and you fetch that measuring rod he used to lay out his new byre. While you're gone, I'll pace off the distance marked in the paper with my pocket compass." Tom Chist was gone for almost an hour, though he ran nearly all the way and back, upborne on the wings of the wind. When he returned, panting, Parson Jones was nowhere to be seen, but Tom saw his footsteps leading away the inland, and he followed the scuffling marks into the smooth surface across the humps and down into the hollows, and by he found the good gentleman in a spot he'd once knew as soon as he laid his eyes upon it. It was the open space where the pirates had driven their first peg, and where Tom Chist had afterwards seen them kill the poor dark man. Now Tom Chist gazed around as though expecting to see some sign of the tragedy. The space was as smooth and as undisturbed as a floor, excepting where, midway across it, Parson Jones, who was now stooping over something on the ground, had trampled it all round about. When Tom Chist saw he was still bending over, scraping away something he had found. Aye, no, it wasn't the dark man, it was the first peg. Inside a half of an hour, they found the second and the third pegs, and Tom Chist stripped off his coat and began digging like mad down into the sand. Parson Jones standing over him, watching him. The sun was sloping well toward the west when the blade of Tom Chist's spade struck upon something hard. If it had been his own heart that he had hit in the sand, his breast could hardly have thrilled more sharply. It was the treasure box. Parson Jones himself leaped down into the hole and began scraping away the sand with his hands as though he had gone crazy. At last, with some difficulty, they tugged and hauled the chest up out of the sand to the surface where it lay covered all over with the grit that clung to it. It was securely locked and fastened with a padlock, and it took a good many blows with the blade of the spade to burst that lock. Parson Jones himself lifted the lid. Tom Chist leaned forward and gazed down into the open box. He would not have been surprised to have seen it full of yellow gold and bright jewels, but it was filled half full of books and papers, and half full of canvas bags tied safely and securely around and around with cords of string. Parson Jones lifted out one of the bags, and it jingled as he did so. Aye, it was full of money. He cut the string, and with trembling, shaking hands, he handed the bag to Tom, who, in an ecstasy of wonder and dizzy with delight, poured out with swimming sight upon the coat spread on the ground a cataract of shining silver money that rang and twinkled and jingled as it fell in a shining heap upon that coarse cloth. Parson Jones held up both hands into the air, and Tom stared at what he saw, wondering whether it was all so, whether he was really awake. It seemed to him as though he was in a dream. There were 22 bags, all in that chest, 10 of them full of silver money, 8 of them full of gold money, and 3 of them full of gold dust, and 1 small bag with jewels wrapped up in a wad of cotton and paper. "Oh, it is enough," cried out Parson Jones. "It's enough, Tommy boy, to make us both rich men as long as we live." Now the burning summer sun, though sloping in the sky, beat down upon them as hot as fire, but neither of them noticed that. Neither did they notice hunger, nor thirst, nor fatigue, but sat there as though in a trance, with bags of money scattered on the sand around them, a great pile of money heaped up on the coat, and an open chest beside them. Now was still an hour of sundown before Parson Jones had begun fairly to examine the books and the papers in the chest. Of the 3 books, 2 were evidently logbooks of the pirates who had been lying off the mouth of the Delaware Bay all this time. The other book was written in Spanish and was evidently the logbook of some captured prize. Now it was then, sitting there upon the sand, the good old gentleman reading in his high, cracking voice, that they first learned from the bloody records in those 2 books who it was who had been lying inside the Cape all that time, and that it was the famous pirate, Captain Kidd. Every now and then, the reverend gentleman would stop to exclaim, "Oh, the bloody wretch!" or "Oh, the desperate, cruel villains!" Then would go on reading again, a scrap here and there, and a scrap there and here. And all the while Tom just sat and listened, every now and then reaching out furtively and touching the heap of money still lying upon the boat. Now, one might be inclined to wonder why Captain Kidd, the pirate, had kept those bloody records. He had probably laid them away because they so incriminated many of the great people of the colony of New York. That with the books in evidence, it would have been impossible to bring the pirate, good pirate or no, to justice without dragging a dozen more of the fine gentlemen into the dock along with him. If he could have kept them in his own possession, he would doubtless have been a great weapon of defense to protect him from the gallows. Indeed, when Captain Kidd was finally brought to conviction and hung, he was not accused of his piracies, but of striking a mutinous seaman upon the head with a bucket and accidentally killing him. The authorities did not dare to try Captain Kidd for piracy. He was really hung because he was a pirate. And we know that it was the logbooks that Tom Chist brought to New York that did the business for him. He was accused and convicted of manslaughter for killing his own ship carpenter with a bucket. Yes, not tax evasion, but carpenter killing. And so Parson Jones, sitting there in the slanting light, read through these terrible records of piracy, and Tom, with a pile of gold and silver money beside him, sat and listened to him. What a spectacle if anyone had come upon them! But they were alone, with the vast arch of sky empty above them and the wide, white stretch of sand, a desert around them. The sun sank lower and lower until there was only time to glance through the other papers in the chest. They were nearly all of Goldsmith's bill of exchange, drawn up in favor of certain prominent merchants of New York. Parson Jones, as he read over the names, knew nearly all of the gentlemen by hearsay. Aye, here was this gentleman, he thought the name would be among them. What? Here is Mr. So-and-so. Well, if all they say is true, the villain has robbed one of his own best friends. You know, I wonder, said Parson Jones, why the wretch should have hidden these papers so carefully away with the other treasures, for they could do him no good. Then answering his own question, you know, like enough, because these will give him a hold over the gentlemen to whom they are drawn, so he can make a good bargain for his own neck before he gives the bills back to their owners. I'll tell you what it is, Tom. It is you yourself, Tommy boy, shall go to New York and bargain for the return of these papers. Ha ha! It'll be as good as another fortune for you. Aye, if you live. Now, the majority of the bills were drawn in favor of one Richard Chillingsworth, Esquire. And he is, said Parson Jones, one of the richest men in the province of New York. You shall go to him with the news of what you have found. Well, when shall I go? Said Tom Chist. And it might be good to point out here, as I mentioned at the beginning of the story, we're running a bit late tonight because it's a pirate story. It's a long pirate story. I don't think quite as long as last week, but a wee bit. And then we have stories at 9 o'clock, too. Anyway, well, when shall I be going to New York, then? Asked Tom Chist. Tommy boy, you shall go upon the very first boat we can catch. The parson had turned, still holding the bills in his hands, and now fingering over the pile of money that lay yet tumbled out upon the coat. I wonder, Tom, I wonder if you could spare me a score or so of these doubloons. Oh, you shall have 50 score if you choose, said Tom, bursting with gratitude, with generosity in his newly found treasure. Aye, you're as fine a lad as I ever saw, Tommy boy, a fine lad, and I'll thank you to the last day of my life, I will. Tom scooped up a double handful of silver money. Take it, sir, take it, parson, and you may have as much more of it as you want. He poured it into a dish that the good man made of his hands, and the parson made a motion as though to empty it into his pocket. Aye, but then he stopped, as though a sudden doubt occurred to him. Aye, well, I don't know that it's fit for me to take a pirate money after all, he said. Oh, but you're welcome to it, said Tom. Still the parson hesitated. Nay, I'll not take it. It's blood money, Tom. As he spoke, he chucked the whole double handful into the now empty chest, and then arose and dusted the sand from his breeches. And then with a great deal of bustling energy, he helped to tie the bags again and put them all back into the chest. They reburied the chest in the place whence they had taken it, and then the parson folded the precious paper of directions, placed it carefully in his wallet, and swallowed it in his pocket. Tom, he said for perhaps the 20th time that day, your fortune has been made this day. And Tom Chist, as he rattled his in his breeches pocket for half the dozen doubloons he had kept out of the treasure, felt that what his friend had said was true. As the two went back toward homeward across the level space of sand, Tom Chist suddenly stopped stock still and just looking about him. Aye, it was just here, he said, digging his heel down into the sand, that they killed the poor dark man. Aye, I'm sure it was, Tommy boy, but he was a pirate, and here he lies buried for all time, said Parson Jones. And as he spoke, he dug his cane down into the sand, and Tom Chist shuddered. Now, he was not have been surprised if the ferrule of the cane had struck something soft beneath the level surface, but it did not. Nor was there any sign of the tragedy ever seen again. For whether the pirates had carried away what they had done and buried it elsewhere, or whether the storm and blowing the sand had completely leveled off and hidden all sign of that tragedy where it was enacted, well, it is certain that it never came to sight again, at least so far as Tom Chist and the Reverend Hilary Jones ever knew. And that is the story of the treasure box. Now, all that remains now is to conclude the story of Tom Chist, if you can stay with us, and tell you what became of him in the very end. Now, of course, if you're satisfied with the story up to this time, then scamper off and be back at 9 o'clock for the late night. But if you want to hear the rest of the story of Tom Chist, stick around with me for a few more minutes. Now, it sees that Tom did not go back again to live with the old Matt Abramson. Parson Jones had now taken charge of him and his fortunes, and Tom did not have to go back to that fisherman's hut. Old Abramson talked a great deal about it, and he would come in his cups and harangue the good Parson Jones, and make a vast protestation of what he would do to Tom if he ever caught him for running away. But Tom on all these occasions kept carefully out of his way, and nothing came of the old man's threatenings. Tom used to go over to see his foster mother now and then, but always when the old man was away from home, don't you see? Molly Abramson used to warn him to keep out of her father's way. "Oh, he's as vile a human as ever I've seen, Tommy. He sits sulking all day long, says my belief he'd kill you if he caught you." Now, of course, Tom said nothing, even to Molly, about the treasure, and he and the reverend gentleman kept the knowledge thereof to themselves. About 3 weeks later, Parson Jones managed to get him shipped aboard a vessel bound for New York town, and a few days later Tom Chist landed at that place. He'd never been in such a town before, and he could not sufficiently wonder and marvel at the number of brick houses, at the multitude of people coming and going along the fine, hard earthen sidewalk, and the shops and the stores where goods hung in the windows, and most of all the fortifications and the battery at the point, at the rows of threatening cannon, at the scarlet-coated sentries pacing up and down the ramparts. Aye, all of this was very wonderful, and so were the clustered boats riding at anchor in the harbor. It was like a new world to Tom. So different was it from the sand hills and the sedgy levels of Henlopen. Tom Chist. Vorlons. They're the ones that told the awful jokes, aren't they? Oh, wait, no, that was the Vogons. I apologize. Tom Chist took up his lodgings at a coffee house near the town hall, and thence he sent up the postboy a letter written by Parson Jones. Bad poetry, right. The interstellar bad poets of the universe. The Vogons, not the Vorlons. Not the Vorlons at all. I apologize. Tom Chist took up his lodgings at a coffee house, Starbucks by name, near to the town hall. And thence he sent by the postboy a letter written to Parson Jones, by Parson Jones to Master Chillingsworth. In a little while, the boy returned with a message, asking Tom to come up to Mr. Chillingsworth's house that afternoon at 2 o'clock tea. He's Starbuck be a character from the great story by Herman Melville, don't you know? Just like Con was a character from the story by Herman Melville. From hell's heart I stab at thee, for the hate's sake. Yes, ma'am, I'll get back to the story. Anyway, Tom went thither with a great deal of trepidation, and his heart fell away altogether when he found it a fine grand brick house, 3 stories high, with wrought iron letters across the front. The counting house was in the same building, but Tom, because of Mr. Jones' letter, was conducted directly into the parlor where the great rich man was awaiting his coming. He was sitting in a leather-covered armchair, smoking a pipe of tobacco, with a fine bottle of old Madeira close to his elbow. Now, young Tom had not had a chance to buy a new suit of clothes yet, and so he cut no very fine figure in the rough dress he had brought with him from Henlopen. Nor did Mr. Chillingsworth seem to think very highly of his appearance, for he sat looking sideways at Tom as he smoked. Well, my lad, and what is this great thing you have to tell me that's so mightily wonderful, eh? I got Mr. Jones' letter, and now I'm ready to hear what you have to say, boy. But if Mr. Chillingsworth thought but little of his visitor's appearance, he soon changed his sentiments towards him. For Tom had not spoken 20 words when Mr. Chillingsworth's whole aspect changed. He became chilled, you might say. He straightened himself up in his seat, he laid aside his pipe, he pushed away his glass of Madeira, He bade Tom take a chair. He listened without a word as Tom Chist told of the buried treasure, of how he had seen the poor dark man murdered, of how he and Parson Jones had recovered the chest again. Only once did Mr. Chillingsworth interrupt the narrative. And to think, he cried, that the villain this very day walks about New York town as though he was an honest man, ruffling with the best of us. But if we can only get a hold of those logbooks you speak of. Go on, boy, tell me more of this. When Tom Chist's narrative was ended, Mr. Chillingsworth's bearing was as different as daylight is from dark. He asked 1,000 questions, all in the most polite and gracious tone imaginable now, and not only urged a glass of his fine old Madeira upon Tom, but asked him to stay to supper. There was nobody to be there, he said, but his wife and daughter. Tom, all in a panic at the very thought of the two ladies, sturdily refused to stay even for the dish of tea Mr. Chillingsworth offered him. He did not know that he was destined to stay there as long as he should live. And now, said Mr. Chillingsworth, tell me about yourself, boy. Well, I have nothing to tell. I have nothing to tell, Your Honor. Except that I was washed up out of the sea, said Tom. Oh, you were washed up out of the sea, were you? Well, how was that? Exclaimed Mr. Chillingsworth. Come, begin at the beginning and tell me all. And thereupon Tom Chist did as he was bidden, beginning at the very beginning of the story as we have tonight, and telling everything just as Molly Abramson had often told it to him. As he continued, Mr. Chillingsworth's interest changed into an appearance of stronger and stronger excitement. Suddenly, he jumped up out of his chair and began to walk up and down the room. Stop, he cried out at last, in the midst of something Tom was saying. Stop! Tell me, do you know the name of the vessel that was wrecked and from which you were washed ashore? Well, I've heard it said, said Tom Chist. 'Twas the Bristol Merchant. I knew it! Exclaimed the great man in a loud voice, flinging up his hands into the air. We've but 3 minutes to the end of this story, and I knew it was going to be that. I felt it was so the moment you began your story. But tell me this, Tom boy. Was there nothing found with you, with a mark or name upon it? Aye, there was a kerchief, said Tom, marked with a T and a C. Some said it was meant to spell out the cat, but actually, my mother and the parson decided it was my name, and they named me Tom Chist, T and C, don't you see? Aye, it's not that at all, boy. It was Theodosia Chillingsworth. Chillingsworth, boy! I knew it! Heavens, to think of anything so wonderful happening at this. Boy, dost thou know who thou art? Thou art my own brother's son. You're my blessed nephew. His name was Oliver Chillingsworth. He was my partner in business, and thou art his son. Then he ran out of the entryway, shouting and calling for his wife and daughter to come. And so, Tom Chist, or Thomas Chillingsworth, if you please, as he now was to be called, did stay to supper after all. Now, this is the story. I hope you may like it. For Tom Chist became rich and great, as was to be supposed. He married his pretty cousin Theodosia, who had been named for his own mother, drowned in the Bristol Merchant. Tom did not forget his friends, but had Parson Jones brought to New York town to live. As to Molly and Matt Abramson, they both enjoyed a pension of £10 a year for as long as they lived. And for now, that all was well with him, Tom bore no grudge against the old fisherman for all the drubbings he had suffered. The treasure box? Aye, that was brought on to New York town, and if Tom Chist did not get all the money there was in it, as Parson Jones had opined he should, well, Tom at least got a good big lump of it. And it's my belief that those logbooks did more to get Captain Kidd arrested in Boston town and hanged in London than anything else that was ever brought up against him. So that, my friends, is the story of Tom Chist and the treasure box. Oh, and of Captain Kidd, who was a pirate. Thank you for listening to StoryLink Radio. If you like what you've just heard, we hope you will subscribe to our podcast and pass along our web address, www.storylinkradio.com. Be sure to visit our website for show notes, to find out how to join our live audience, and for lots of free stuff, including free audiobooks and much more. Join us next time for another story from StoryLink Radio.